How's that? Is that good? Okay, great. I dated myself by asking if I was going to have to wear the Madonna thing. I think there's, like I said, I'm dating myself. I won't even go there. There's a lot more recent examples of people that wear this, I'm sure. So thank you all for coming tonight to our introduction to cultivating emotional balance. I always think that whenever there's the word emotion in the title, we always get a bigger turnout. Now here there's really bad traffic, so we may have some people drifting in. But I think this is one of the things that everybody really, would like. We'd all like a little bit more clarity about some techniques, no matter whether we're Buddhist or not. We're definitely all interested in ways to deal with our emotions. And so hopefully throughout our time together, we'll get some tips, some pointers of how to work with our emotions. What I'm doing with this class is kind of consolidating a 42-hour program, and I'm going to talk in just a minute about kind of the background of this program that was developed. And the full program is 42 hours, and we don't have that much time. We've got about 8 hours, but I'm going to give you tea breaks halfway through so we can shave off about half an hour for breaks. But I've been doing day-long introductions to this Cultivating Emotional Balance program, not only at Dharma centers, but it's very popular in prisons. I do a lot of prison teaching, and prison inmates, like everybody else, maybe even especially so, are very interested in working a little bit more with their emotional kind of reality, controlling, managing, somehow getting a handle on their emotional life. And so the founders of this program and I kind of consolidated some of the essence into a day-long program, and that's what I'm going to be presenting to all of you, hopefully over the 4 evenings tonight, tomorrow night, and next Wednesday and Thursday. And if it's at all possible, or I should say if you're still interested by 9 o'clock tonight, if I haven't completely lost you or turned you off, it's really great to attend the full kind of 4-night sessions, just because the information kind of builds on each other, and so you might miss kind of an essential piece if you don't come back until next Thursday. You might be a little bit lost, because like I said, I really am trying to take the essence of the information, consolidate it all into 8 hours. So I just urge you, if you are interested and if it's at all possible, to try and make it to all 4 nights of the program. When I was invited to teach here, and then I was talking to Marianne, who probably some of you know, the program coordinator, and she said, oh, could you teach Wednesday and Thursday nights during the 2 weeks that you're there? And I said, okay, I could do something completely different every night for 4 nights. We could do that. Or I could do, a little kind of mini class. And then I suggested this one because I knew it would really fit well. And she, oh yeah, let's do that. Emotions, yeah, everybody wants that. So we'll see how we go. What I'm going to be presenting is a little bit of background on the Cultivating Emotional Balance program. We're going to be talking a little bit about the definition of an emotion and the definitions of happiness, 2 words we throw around a lot without necessarily defining them clearly, talking about kind of what happiness is and what some of the elements leading to happiness. A big part of it is, working with our emotional life. What an emotion is, we'll contrast and compare a little bit the Buddhist idea with the kind of Western psychological idea. And it's quite interesting. There isn't a word, apparently, in Tibetan, Sanskrit, Pali, and most of the classical Buddhist languages that exactly corresponds with the word emotion. So that's quite interesting. And there was a big conference where Tibetan Buddhist masters and Western psychologists got together and talked about this. But there is some overlap between the Buddhist idea and the Western psychological ideas, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll get into looking at something called the emotional episode timeline. That's when things will get a little bit workshoppy. I'll divide you into small groups, and you're going to be working with your own emotional episodes. I know it's really scary sounding, but This is a safe space. We're going to set up ground rules for communication just to sort of work with your own emotional experience after we go through some of the kind of lay the groundwork, and then we'll look at that, because one of the interesting things in working and bringing awareness to our emotional life is sometimes we think an emotional episode is just like, that's it, the whole thing just sort of happened to me, and how am I supposed to have any awareness and kind of management or regulation around that thing that just happens? So by breaking it down, kind of parsing it out into little pieces, we can see how we can bring our awareness to each piece of it and regulate our emotions. Hopefully that's one of the goals. The long 42-hour program involves a lot of contemplative practices. We won't have a lot of time for the meditations that go along with it. Luckily, I'm teaching in a Buddhist center, so I can assume that you're going to be getting some of the meditations in your other classes. For those of you that are students here, I'll definitely mention, and we'll do a little bit of contemplation, but not as much time as we would have if we had the full program. And then we'll look at a couple of the universal emotions. We'll look a lot at anger, because anger is one of the ones that I think if we all had to pick the emotion that we would like to regulate the most, it might be anger. I don't think we need to really need a lot of convincing in, seeing how it can often be a destructive emotion, both for our own and others' well-being. So we'll look in detail at anger, and then we'll see how we're doing with time and look at some of the other universal emotions, but we'll definitely pick up on anger as one of the ones that we'll look closely at. And so that's a little bit the agenda. I know it seems, like a lot for the 4 nights, and it is. I won't lie. It's going to be intense. Especially tonight's going to be a lot of sort of definitions and information. And then we'll start unpacking a little bit more. So we'll have, discourse, me up here going blah, blah, blah. We'll have some workshop where, you guys are working with some of the ideas on your own, and we'll have some contemplation. So it'll be kind of a combination of those 3 modalities over the time that we have together. Okay. So let's go into the background, a little bit of the background and history of this Cultivating Emotional Balance program. Whoops, skipped. Very sensitive mouse. So, the history of Cultivating Emotional Balance, many of you will recognize the gentleman in the middle with his cap on. He wears always a visor when he teaches, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for exactly the reason that it would be nice to have a visor up here because of the lights going right into his sensitive eyes. And so, as some of you who are familiar with Buddhism or the Dalai Lama might know, the Dalai Lama is very interested in Western science, Western psychology, and he meets usually every year or 2 with a group of Western scientists and psychologists to talk about a subject. There's these conferences called the Mind and Life conferences that have been happening since, I think, the late 80s. Was when they started, that His Holiness is very, very interested in, and they're organized around a certain topic, and then the leading thinkers in that kind of subject matter are invited to come. For many, many years, they always happened in Dharamsala in northern India, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama lived, and there were kind of these closed conferences, closed to the participants and invited guests, so it was kind of this closed thing that would happen for 4 or 5 days. Recently, they've become more open and more public, and I think there was one sponsored by MIT here a couple of years ago. Is that right? Like was it last year or year before last? A couple of years ago, yeah. So they've opened them up more to the public, to, so that the rest of us can observe these conferences. And the subject matter for the conference that happened in the year 2000 was destructive emotions. And so neuroscientists were invited, psychologists were invited, Tibetan Buddhist meditation teachers were invited, quite roster of people were invited to this conference where they were talking about destructive emotions, both from the Buddhist kind of framework and then from the Western psychological framework. One of the people who's invited is often sort of seen as one of the foremost emotions researchers, and his name is Paul Ekman. And in this picture, that's him on the right-hand side with the picture of the Golden Gate Bridge behind him. I think he Skyped into this conference. He was actually at the one in 2000, but I think the picture of this one, he Skyped in. And he's one of the foremost emotions researchers. There was a television show, which I never saw, based on his life called Lie to Me, because he was just about ready to retire, and he was going to devote his life to his photography and his hobbies. And then 9/11 happened, and a lot of governments asked for his help in determining how can you tell when somebody's lying. And so he was asked to be a consultant, and it started this whole second career working with security forces and so forth to try and train people how to, spot somebody who is not telling the truth. So that was the basis of this television show, which I never saw, but it's, quite famous. So that was Paul Ekman, and it was interesting when he was invited to this, as a foremost emotions researcher, he was invited to the conference in the year 2000, and he did not want to go at all. He calls himself a Jewish atheist, and he just thought that Buddhism was mumbo jumbo, this new age crazy thing. He had no interest whatsoever. The Dalai Lama, who's that? Who wants to meet him? His daughter, Eve, at that point, was a teenager, and she was volunteering for a Free Tibet, political movements in San Francisco, and she was dying to meet the Dalai Lama, and he was allowed to bring one guest. And so that was the reason that he actually went to the conference, so he could bring his daughter Eve. It's interesting because Eve and I now co-teach this 42-hour program together, and Paul Ekman came to observe. He'd never seen the program taught, and he came to watch us teach it just in August in California, and he told the story, and he was like, if it wasn't for her, none of this would have happened. It was just that she was all, political activist, so that was how it happened. Another person who was at the 2000 meeting is all the way on the left-hand side. You can see Alan Wallace, and some of you may know Alan Wallace, or you've read some of his books, a really well-known Western meditation teacher. And so at the end of this conference on destructive emotions in the year 2000, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, oh, this is great, bringing this secular Western psychological viewpoint together with Buddhist contemplative techniques, and I think it would be awesome for there to be a program bringing Buddhist contemplative techniques, but not within the context of Buddhism, not talking about karma and rebirth and all these things that we're good at talking about, with the Western psychological material, and come up with a program. He said this could really, really help people. And so he asked for volunteers, looking very pointedly at Paul Ekman and Alan Wallace. So does anybody want to volunteer to do such a thing? And of course they had to say yes, so they collaborated. Alan Wallace providing the, Western contemplative techniques, and then Paul Ekman providing the emotions research from Western psychology. So that was kind of the origin of this program. And it's 42 hours, and apparently the reason for that is somebody asked the Dalai Lama how long should it be, and he said 42 hours. So there we go. That was the reason. So that was the history of cultivating emotional balance. And then after the program was developed by these two in collaboration, because Paul Ekman is this world-class emotions researcher, there needed to be a study, peer-reviewed, double-blind, whatever, those words that they use. And so he really wanted to have a study. He said, before we're going to launch this thing, we need to study it to show that it's effective, that it really works. And I remember when I heard this, I thought, oh, that's interesting. We never actually did a peer-reviewed study of Buddhism, but I guess 2,600 years of success and producing people like the Dalai Lama, I guess that's good enough, But that's kind of not the world that I inhabit, so I had a lot of, a lot of respect for him insisting that before we start to kind of train people to teach this program. So they did a study, and the results were that the people who participated in the study showed a significant decrease in depression, anxiety, and hostility over a 5-week period. So they had two groups. They had one group that got some instruction, but not the meditation instruction. So the control group just got the psychological information, but they didn't actually do any of the practices. So this is the difference between the control group and then the people who actually meditated. Had a significant decrease in depression, anxiety, hostility, significant increase in affection for others, significant improvement in their ability to detect subtle forms of emotional expression. And this is one of the purposes of the training also, is learning how to identify expression of emotion, because this is one of Paul Ekman's main research topics, actually, is in the facial expression of emotion, and we'll talk more about that later on when we talk about his research. Less emotional and physiological reactivity to a stress test compared to reactivity prior to training. So all that was shown in this rigorous study, and then Paul Ekman kind of gave his stamp of approval, and then started a program to train teachers of this 42-hour program. And I did my teacher training, which was a five full weeks in Mexico in 2013. So I think I was the third or fourth cohort of teachers being trained in how to deliver this modality, this 42-hour cultivating emotional balance. But it really has been shown to be effective. And then just, of course, not just the original study, but a lot of the participants that have gone through it have said how helpful it is, you know, to go through it, to continue to do the meditation practices and so forth. So like I said, we don't have time for the whole 42 hours, but I'm going to try and give you some of the tidbits of what I think are the highlights of the training, and even that can be very helpful. In April, I think it was, I was invited to do this training in Folsom State Prison. Anybody remember the Johnny Cash song, Folsom State Prison? So I have two prison groups that I go to that are very low key. They're guys who've like left the gang life. They're under special protection because they've gotten out of their gangs and the whole prison politics and all of this business. So this group that I was invited to teach was still actively in the gang life in a level 4 prison, which is the highest level of security. And so I go in there, and I hadn't worked with that population in a while. I had before, but not for a while. So I go in, and the organizers of the training say to me as I go in, they go, well, there's 50 guys signed up. And I'm like, that's awesome, 50 guys coming to the training. And they go, but they're from rival gangs, and, you know, we're not sure how it's going to go. They go, we hope there won't be any violence, but they just may shut down and not like share at all. And I just go, you know what? I trust this program. It's going to be fine. You know? And they were amazing. They were awesome. I mean, they really were from rival gangs. And they walked in, and I was like, wow, I haven't been with guys like this in a long time. Like, their arms are like this big. I mean, they walk in, they can't even put, because a couple of gangs, they have this like code of conduct. And for a lot of the gangs, you have to work out. Like, that's one of the rules of being in that gang. And I was like, no kidding. One guy at the afternoon, we developed some trust, and I go poke at his arm that's like this big, and I'm, dude, you're slacking off, you know, you really need to work out. But they just took it on board, and in one day, they were amazing and shared like so much vulnerability. I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking, because a lot of it's workshoppy, and you share a certain amount of vulnerability, and I was going, wow, if there's no trust, you know, I don't know how this is going to go, and it was just amazing. So, setting the bar a little high for you guys, but I'm sure that you guys will do great. One of the things about this class, even in the short form of this class, especially when we get to the point of sharing our emotional episodes, is I ask for confidentiality within the group, right? Because I really do want you to share things that might be very personal, so I ask that we just keep kind of confidentiality of whatever's shared. Maybe even when we get to that point, we won't film some of it. Sometimes when we record these classes, we record mostly me teaching, but then when the group is coming back with their emotional episodes, we turn the recorder off, just so that people do have that confidentiality, and so I'd like to ask for that. If you want to tell somebody in your life about the class and what happened, and even share somebody's emotional episode, but just not using any kind of identifying, features that will enable anybody on the outside to kind of know who it was that shared that episode. So that worked for the guys in prison, and so I think it'll work for all of us. Any questions up to this point? We're going to go into the purpose of cultivating emotional balance and start talking a little bit about happiness and emotions. But any questions about what I've talked about so far? Can everybody see the screen? I can't see everybody, but hopefully everybody's moved around so you can see the screen. Anything at all? Okay. All right, so the purpose of the training, let's look at that. So the purpose of cultivating emotional balance to identify and cultivate genuine happiness, support the cultivation of genuine happiness through leading a constructive emotional life, and create a choice in how we engage with our emotions. So sometimes I think there's a bit of a Buddhist rumor. I don't know if any of you have heard this rumor that to be a good Buddhist or, to be enlightened kind of means that you're detached and stoic and non-reactive, and you're just sort of like, in this deep state of like bliss all the time, and nothing ever rocks it. And anybody heard this rumor? Right? Okay, from the snickering, I think we have. The point of Buddhist practice or cultivating emotional balance is not to wipe out our emotions. Sometimes we think emotions are the enemy, and we need to somehow, emotional balance means wipe them out completely. My emotions are nothing but trouble. Maybe she's going to tell me how to get rid of them completely. Well, full disclosure, and if you want to leave right now, it's totally okay. That is not what I'm going to tell you, because our emotions actually have a function and have a purpose, and we'll talk about this. As Paul Ekman's an evolutionary psychologist, so we're going to talk a lot about the evolutionary benefit of emotions. But the point is, can we get a handle on our emotional expression? Can we regulate our emotional expression? All emotions, even the ones that feel unpleasant, and we'll look at that too, have a function, but it's just about getting a little bit of a handle on the regulation of emotions. It's not about suppressing them. It certainly isn't about eliminating them, but it is about getting a little bit of control over our emotional life, choosing when, where, and how to express our emotions. That's a lifelong task, but hopefully, I'll give you a couple of clues about how to do that. Now, in the purpose, right here in the first kind of bullet point, identify and cultivate genuine happiness. So let's talk about that for a minute. When I say the word happiness, we throw this around a lot. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, every time he opens his mouth, says, everyone wants happiness and wants to avoid suffering. Has anybody heard him say this, right? I remember hearing a while ago, one of his translators for many years, Jeffrey Hopkins, the great scholar, said, I translated for His Holiness the Dalai Lama for like 15 years. And he goes, no matter what the topic he was teaching, within the first paragraph, he always said the same thing. All beings want happiness and want to avoid suffering. And he goes, I could only come to one of two conclusions. Either he doesn't have anything else to say, or this is really, really, really important. So we can say that, but what is happiness? What are some of the characteristics of happiness or the things that give us happiness? Either one. It's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually asking you to answer. What do you think when you think about happiness? What things give you happiness? What are some of the characteristics of happiness? And don't give what you think is the correct Buddhist answer, but give what comes up for you.
Spiritual practice. So that's.
Oh, that's right. Buddhist answer. Yeah, right. So that's what kind of gives you a sense of happiness. Is it the same kind of happiness as the happiness you get from ice cream?
No. And chocolate cake is also an
Oh,
example I hear a lot.
yeah. It's sort of a metaphor. You can fill in the blank with whatever. Yeah. So spiritual practice. Okay, good. Anybody else? Happiness, what? Brings it, what is it? Yes.
Beauty.
Beauty. Okay, so like appreciating beautiful things. Great. What else?
Joy.
Yeah, so joy is kind of a synonym, maybe, for happiness. So what kind of things, what's the feeling of joy, or what gives you joy?
Running through a field, I know that. And
Okay,
yeah.
so this kind of like, just this exuberant sort of experience of something for you. Yes?
I was just thinking fortune.
Fortune. So when good things happen. Yeah, when we get some maybe unexpected especially, right? It even gives you more happiness when you're not expecting it at all. Okay, good. What else?
Connection.
Connection. Who said that? Yeah, connection with others, so relationship, right? Yeah. And
like an enduring sense of fearlessness, like you can,
okay.
can feel it.
Oh, great, awesome. So it's kind of like this courageous, like resilience almost.
Yeah, that you're not just sort of bouncing around on the...
Yeah. So not so much reacting to what happens, but more kind of...
Right, it's a sustainable and internally generated sense, not something that kind of feels dependent and conditional.
Okay. Yeah. So conditional on circumstance.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, good, great. Anything else? Yes.
I think love is important.
Love. So that kind of the connection, the love, the relationship. Yeah. Yes.
I would say, for me, like to do something nice for someone else.
Okay.
And have it come just genuinely. It's not like a force kind of doing something for somebody else. It just kind of springs up.
Just a very spontaneous,
spontaneous, that's the word. Yes.
Selfless kind of service and so on. And did you have something? Somebody else was calling out over here. Anybody? Yeah.
Sometimes just being in the nature, looking at the sky or hearing the birds singing and kind of have, I think it's joy or happiness.
Okay, nice. So being in nature. And it's interesting, one of Paul Ekman's students is a researcher at the Greater Good Science Center. There is such a thing. A place where they study positive emotions. Of course, it's at the University of California in Berkeley, where you'd expect the Greater Good Science Center to be. And he is the foremost researcher in the emotion of awe. And he says one of the gateways to experiencing awe and wonder is very much nature, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like the Grand Canyon. It can just be kind of being out in nature, even in a more low-key way. So we'll look at this whole group of enjoyable emotions and parse out, according to the psychologists, there's 16 different enjoyable emotions, and awe or wonder that comes from being in nature is one of those. So we'll look at that later on. Anything else? Yes.
Attachment, meaning that because your emotion don't depend on any sense of object to make you happy.
Yeah.
You just like if good thing happen, just your emotion is stable.
More stable and not so.
Is still remain calm. I think that's one.
Yeah, and somebody else said that. Was it you? It's not so dependent on outside factors for your happiness. So there's more stability there. It's not just this kind of roller coaster ride all over the place. And you had something, Gratitude. So gratitude really leads to happiness. Yeah, and that's one of some of these positive emotions researchers recommend happiness practices, and gratitude always tops the list of the happiness practices that are recommended. Yeah. So good. Well, we got a lot of the things, not only the things that kind of give us happiness, but some of the characteristics of happiness. Now it's interesting because the psychologists identify sort of two domains of happiness. And sometimes they use these fancy Greek words, hedonia and eudaimonia. So don't worry, I will translate them into ordinary English. So hedonic happiness. And so a lot of us are used to the word hedonic. You say somebody's a hedonist, or they have hedonic happiness. So this is more of a happiness that comes from experience of sensory pleasure, experience that comes from enjoying things that come from the outside. And last time I taught this, somebody said, "Oh, this is a picture of Tenzin Choki before she became a nun." And I was wondering if all my possessions now would fit into those shopping bags, and probably not, unfortunately. That would be nice. But it's happiness that comes from experiencing, sense objects from the outside. And nothing is wrong with that at all, right? Don't think that there's something wrong with the chocolate cake and the ice cream and the cute boyfriend and all of that. But if our happiness is limited to only things that come from the outside, what are the problems with that? Some of you guys have mentioned it. Yeah, they might go away. How much can we control things on the outside? Even if you're like, I am a recovering black belt control freak. I'm in recovery. It's a slippery slope. I think of myself more as a control enthusiast. Not so much of a control freak. But, if we're trying to control everything on the outside, it's just impossible. The only thing we have even hope of controlling is our own mind. So we're setting ourselves up, aren't we? If our happiness really depends on things from the outside, and especially depends on things on the outside staying stable and having them and living happily ever after, whoever made up that ending for the fairy story, it just sets us up for such bitter disappointment. So that's one of the problems with, if there's too much emphasis on this hedonic happiness that comes from people, places, things on the outside that we're enjoying. Nothing wrong with enjoying things like that and the chocolate cake, but to get some balance around that, because if all of our happiness is dependent on that, then we're going to get disappointed. There's also, even if the things don't, even if the things last, there's this terrible, pesky evolutionary thing that happens called hedonic adaptation. And that means even if you keep having the same thing, it loses its, kind of quality of giving you pleasure. Does the fifth piece of chocolate cake taste as good as the first one? Does the fifth bite taste as good as the first bite? We have this way of just getting used to the things that we have, right? This adaptation that we have, that was evolutionarily, it really helped us because we're always noticing new novel things in our environment, which helped us survive. But it's really a drag when it comes to the things that we enjoy, the pleasures that come from people, places, and things, because we habituate. The new car is so exciting for the first, couple of weeks, and then you don't even notice it anymore. Let's not even talk about relationship. We will, but that's another one. So the attachment, we're so disappointed often, and then we think it's the fault of the thing. Oh no, it's the fault of the person or the thing or the experience that it didn't give us the happiness that we were really expecting it to give. So those are some of the problems with hedonic happiness. Now, cultivating emotional balance is not going to tell you, eat bread and water, and shave your head and wear the same clothes every day so you really get a lot of extra airport security and, give away all of your possessions. This is not the point of cultivating emotional balance. Doesn't matter how much stuff we have, but just having a really balanced attitude towards the things that we have. And then prioritizing this other kind of happiness. Aristotle coined the word eudaimonia, which we are usually translate as genuine happiness. And I found this picture, which I think really typifies this genuine happiness. Two boys and a chicken and a waterfall. You know, you don't need much to be really happy. I think this must be like Indonesia or something. I don't know what the source is. But it's a happiness, and many of you mentioned it when we talked about happiness. Happiness that comes a lot more from what you can bring to the world rather than what you can get from the world. That's kind of an easy way of thinking about it. It's like the quality of being that you bring to others and to the world that actually is a source of a more deep, long-lasting happiness. Now, there are billions and trillions of dollars of advertising industry money trying to convince you that this one is the one that's really going to work for you, and then forget about this one. But it's not true. Lord Buddha said it, Paul Ekman said it, I'm saying it right now. So tapping into, and again, not completely ignoring the hedonic happiness, it's fun, but getting some balance and really trying to tap into that deeper sense of well-being. And this lady in the back was saying service. I think he said, who was it that said serving others, benefiting others? There she is. There she is. I know it's somebody in the back row, in the shadows back there. Serving others. How many of us have, done something that's been like incredible service and you're totally blissed out? I had a day that I always use as an example, and it was one of the days I went to prison, and I was staying at where I live now. I was actually living in Canada at the time, but I was just there teaching. There's a prison, it's about 2.5 hours away, 3 hours away. I had to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, so I had to leave where I was staying at about 6 o'clock in the morning, drive for 3 hours to go through security, go in, do my class in this incredibly hot, it was like summertime in California. The so-called chapel, I mean, why did they even call it that? It's like a concrete bunker with pews in it. That's the only thing that makes it a chapel. So we're in there for a couple of hours, and then these guys wanted to take Buddhist vows, and so we did a vows ceremony, and then the assistant warden had set up for me to be interviewed by the prison television station. They have their own like closed circuit TV station, so they interviewed me. So this is like 6 a.m. By the time I was interviewed, it was 2 in the afternoon. And again, I had 5 minutes to pee once and like one plastic bottle of water. So I'm like exhausted, dehydrated. We went out to have so-called lunch at like 3:30. Of course, we go somewhere like Denny's that there's no vegetarian food, so I had a salad of iceberg lettuce, which was just wah, after like then I drive back to where I'm staying, get home at about 7:30, so this has been like a 13.5-hour day. I'm dehydrated, I'm starving, I'm exhausted, and I'm totally blissed out. It was so weird. And I remember I'd already taken Cultivating Emotional Balance training, and I go, oh, this is that thing, right? Like, it felt like every minute of that day was worthwhile and beneficial and of service. So who cares that I'm starving and exhausted and dehydrated and really need to pee? Like, that didn't make any difference at all. And so sometimes it'll be that extreme that you really notice that thing of like really, going out there. I was living in Santa Cruz, California, which is, I always describe it, I don't know if any of you have been there, I always describe it as a hippie surfer college town. Like, that's kind of the vibe of it. And so I got a call. The local Waldorf school needed me to come in to talk to the 7th graders because the boys were being mean to the girls. And I'm like, oh, dude, only in Santa Cruz would they need the Buddhist nun. It's a 13-year-old boy's job description to be mean to the girls. Like, only in this hippie college town would they need the Buddhist nun. I'm like, okay, whatever. Like, this is totally going to work. So I go in, give me a room full of gang members in prison any day over 13-year-olds. They're just like, oh. They just did not care. I was like, whoa, this is the toughest crowd I've ever had in my life. So I go in there, and I'm trying to kind of like, okay, what's my angle? Maybe a little compassion? Maybe they can get that, So I had them do a meditation for about 7 minutes because they're 13 years old. And I said, okay, think back in your life the times that you were the happiest in your life, because I was trying to get them to have a little empathy of other people need happiness too and this whole thing. And actually, I was shocked when we did the go round. I couldn't believe not one of these kids, and there were about 20, 13-year-olds, not one of them said a happy memory of when they got something they wanted for Christmas. It was all either relational or helping someone. And I was like, wow, even I know the right answer, and I'm shocked. They were all like, oh, when my brother comes home for Thanksgiving and my family's all together again, or when I help my little sister with her homework, or when me and my friends are together and we're laughing and having a good time. So every last one of them was either about relationship or about service, even for the 13-year-olds. And I was blown away because I thought, well, the 13-year-olds, it's going to be about getting what their Xbox or whatever thing that 13-year-olds are really into these days. I'm like so out of it, I have no idea what that even is. Not at all. Not at all. So it's very interesting, and sometimes when I'm teaching this class over time, I say, keep a journal, and when you feel a subjective feeling of happiness, note down, hey, what just happened? What just gave you that moment of happiness? And it's usually those two things. It's also when something kind of brings your attention back into the moment, the present moment, whatever it is. And the nature thing and the awe thing can be that. I had a student, I always remember this example. She said she was walking down her walk, going to work, her head filled with all of her projects and all the emails and things she had to do. And then she saw this spider's web covered in dew with the sun reflecting off of it, making like a zillion prisms. And she said she just stopped, and all of a sudden her attention was just like right into that moment. And she said she just felt this subjective feeling of this incredible kind of calm and peace and, this real deep sense of well-being in that moment. So it's usually that. So it's interesting when we check, and a little bit later on we'll do a practice, we'll do that, just kind of draw from memory, and what is it really? It usually is often that deeper sense of well-being that comes more from this kind of presence of being that you bring to the world rather than just kind of what you get from the world. So any questions about that or any reflections on the difference between that hedonic happiness and a deeper sense of well-being? Yeah, probably all experienced that. And then we talk about genuine happiness. Usually we talk about kind of three things that lead to genuine happiness: ethics, mental balance, and wisdom. And so ethics, we're not going to really talk about ethics in this Cultivating Emotional Balance class, but living an ethical life leads to a deep sense of well-being. In Buddhism, I'm allowed to talk about Buddhism because here we are at Kurukulla, the basis of ethics is really non-harming. And one of my friends who's a Buddhist monk talks about the bliss of blamelessness and this peace of mind that really comes from leading an ethical life when you don't have a lot of regrets, especially really helpful for your meditation practice. In Buddhism, we talk about the 3 higher trainings, and we say that ethics is a foundation for concentration, which is a foundation for wisdom. So if you're trying to meditate really, really well, it helps a lot to lead an ethical life, because you sit down to meditate and you've just been like, cheating people at work and yelling at this other person and who knows what. Your mind is really going to be filled with regret, and it's going to be a lot harder to get that mental balance or that sense of that calm, peaceful, focused mind. So ethics is very fundamental. That's another one of the things His Holiness the Dalai Lama is really trying to work on, is developing a system of secular ethics. Because he says, kind of throughout history, our ethics was very much tied into our religious systems, but so many people nowadays don't really identify with any religion. So he says, so what happens to ethics? There's just no ethical framework at all. So this is one of the things he's giving a lot of attention to right now, is really developing, some kind of a system of secular ethics. There's a great book by His Holiness called Beyond Religion, where he talks about this a lot, and that kind of secular ethical basis. And then mental balance, peaceful, calm, non-reactive. We've talked about that a lot in terms of kind of the genuine happiness and the aspect of genuine happiness that comes from that mental balance. And then wisdom, seeing things clearly without exaggeration, without distortion. I know a lot of you have studied here at Kurukulla, and you might have studied the Buddhist concept of emptiness or selflessness. Really seeing things clearly without distortion is a big part of that teaching, and we say that wisdom comes from that. So even if you haven't studied the Buddhist teachings on emptiness, you can see that seeing things clearly without distortion leads to happiness. How much when we exaggerate, when we overestimate, somebody says something and you're in a certain state of mind and you just take it wrong, and it leads to an emotional episode for you. So that aspect of wisdom is very much a key as well. And so what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the time is really this mental balance, sort of that one aspect of mental balance leading to genuine happiness. Also, we're going to be talking more about genuine happiness than hedonic happiness. I'm not here to tell you how to get more possessions and more of the chocolate cake and the ice cream in life. I'm expecting that, you've got that pretty much handled. And so we're not going to be talking about that at all. It's interesting, when we talk about happiness and the balance between hedonic happiness and genuine happiness, there are a lot of studies done that show no correlation between increased income and increased happiness. There's a graph that I don't have here on this slide presentation, but it's basically showing in the United States since World War II, the increase in income is huge, and self-reported happiness stays the same, even declines a little bit. And what they don't show in those studies is things like anxiety and depression have also increased astronomically. So after your basic needs have been met, there's really no correlation between income and happiness. Before your basic needs have been met, absolutely, for sure. If you're a homeless person sleeping in a cold park with not enough to eat, absolutely. Your hedonic happiness is going to be very fundamental to your happiness, and the things that coming from the outside. But after your basic needs have been met, there's really no correlation at all, which might be what gives rise to, the increases of anxiety and depression. We're really led to believe that from our secular consumerist culture. And then it's quite disappointing when it doesn't pan out that way. You go for those kind of things and it doesn't work out, and you're just left going, well, okay, I tried that, and that didn't work. Now what? And I think that can very much lead to depression and anxiety. So I think there's a correlation there. I want to get into talking about the definition of emotion, but let's have a little break. We're about halfway through. I asked if you guys usually have a break, and sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But let's get up and stretch for about 10 minutes, have a short break, and then we'll come back and start talking about the definition of emotion. Okay, so we're going to look at the definition of emotion, but just like we did with happiness, first I'm going to ask you, when I say the word emotion, what comes up for you? What kind of characteristics of an emotion or qualities of an emotion? What do you think? Yeah.
Negative or neutral.
Okay.
Feeling tone associated.
So some feeling tone of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Okay, good, good. What else?
Sensations in the body?
So sensations in the body that accompany the emotion? Okay, so some kind of physiological changes? Good. What else? Yeah.
Like I had experience today about like it's a pain, it depends of it's a bad emotion. It's a pain when
So you feel a pain, a physical pain when
Physical
it's
pain.
some kind of unwanted
Yeah.
or negative emotion? Okay.
I had that today. I was like,
Did you? You might have to share that tomorrow when we map out the emotional episodes. Don't forget what happened today. You can share that with your group tomorrow. Don't put you on the spot here. Yeah.
I hear the word emotion and I always think of like uncontrolled, like emotion is as being an uncontrolled
Yeah.
entity. It's like,
So it's like they control
either positive or negative.
You
It
don't
just spontaneously
control.
rises and it's like, either a flood or some kind of physical, like she said, physical body association with a particular emotion.
Yeah, so it kind of takes over. I mean, I think that's why when we think of emotional regulation, I mean, it almost sounds like an oxymoron. Like, how can I control my emotions? They're just kind of whoosh, and they take you over. So that's one of the things we think too. Yeah. Else, any other characteristics of emotion?
I
Yeah.
think they give the flavor to life.
Yeah.
Imagine life without any emotion, just that flatness.
Right, right. So that idea that emotions are our enemy or we want to get rid of them, wow, what would life be like without, would it even be possible? That's another story, right? Because emotions evolve, and they have a function. Even would we survive without them? And even if we did, what a drag that would be to just have an absolute flat line of our emotional life. Yeah. Anything else? Emotions. What comes up? Can I say the word emotions? Yeah.
Maybe it's because I think of it too much in the Buddhist context now, but
Yeah.
I just think of pain.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And this gets to the different contexts of the Buddhist approach and the Western psychological approach to these things. There is quite a lot of overlap. But like I was saying, and it came up a lot at this meeting that they had in the 2000 on destructive emotions. And by the way, there's a book that is the proceedings from that meeting. Every Mind and Life conference, one of the kind of rules of these conferences is somebody who's attending has to write a book afterwards, giving a presentation of what happened during that meeting. And the one it's called Destructive Emotions, and it's edited by Daniel Goleman, and it's the best. I mean, he puts the flavor in, and we were walking this morning, and it was foggy, and then we had breakfast, and we drank chai, and then we went to the meeting. It's absolutely the best. But they talk a lot in the very beginning about terminology and about this idea. In Buddhism, we have a word that is sometimes wrongly translated as disturbing emotion. The Sanskrit word is klesha, and the Tibetan word is nyomon. And a much better literal translation is mental affliction. And forget about emotion, because the definition of a klesha is any thought that disturbs your peace of mind. So it's seen as a thought. So all this whoosh, it's taking me over, and it's physiological, and it hurts, and it's like hot, and none of that's in there at all. It's just talking about a cognitive event that's disturbing to your peace of mind. That's what a klesha is. So there's obviously a lot of overlap between those things and disturbing emotions, because, for example, anger is considered to be both a mental affliction, very disturbing to our peace of mind, isn't it, anger? And also, obviously, an emotion, from Western psychology. But not everything is both. It's like one of those Venn diagrams of like two sets that have a lot of overlap, but not 100% overlap. There are a lot of things that are disturbing to our peace of mind that aren't considered to be an emotion at all in terms of Western psychology. And it's interesting to look at the different kind of framework. In Western psychology, when we look at disturbing or destructive emotions, we're kind of thinking, what's harmful to our own well-being and others' well-being? In Buddhism, the list of mental afflictions is all about what's going to really mess up my meditation. So it's a really different perspective, and there are a lot of things on this list, like mental dullness and fogginess. That's not an emotion, but it's really going to mess up your meditation. But nobody's going to call that just that sort of buzzed out, spaced out. That's totally on the list of disturbing to your peace of mind and disturbing to your meditation. So it's really interesting, completely different context. And this came up when they were having this meeting of, yeah, there's a ton of overlap. Jealousy's on both lists, anger's on both lists, attachment's on both lists, that clinging, hanging on to their ankles. No, don't leave. That's on both lists. We'll talk more about that one, our personal favorite. So there is a lot of overlap, but not necessarily 100%, because the context of Buddhist, klesha or mental affliction is, oh man, if I sit down on the cushion with one of these things going on, it's going to totally blow my meditation session versus, is this going to be disturbing to my own and others' well-being, right? So not necessarily. So it's really interesting, and that came up. In the text on Buddhist psychology, there's 26 listed of these mental afflictions. And I know some of you are studying awarenesses and knowers. Have you studied mind and mental factors yet? The 51 mental factors? Yeah. So 26 out of 51, it's called mental factors. So there's these things that flavor and color our main awareness. So we have an awareness of an object, it's called main mind in Buddhist philosophy. We've got this awareness of an object. And then there are all of these optional mental factors that can kind of color and flavor our experience. And so these 26 mental afflictions can be in there to sort of flavor our experience. So a lot of them are emotions, but not all of them. So if you hear anybody translate klesha as disturbing emotion, tell them, no, it's not really an emotion, according to the Western definition. And I'll give you a very complete definition. This is not the, dictionary definition, but this is the Paul Ekman definition of an emotion. So we're taking it right from the foremost emotions researchers. So emotion is a process. So this is super important, and we'll look at this more tomorrow when we kind of parse out our emotional episodes. There's a whole timeline, so it's a complicated process, a particular kind of automatic appraisal influenced by our evolutionary and personal past. And this leads to some of the function of emotion. Emotions help us appraise instantly. It short circuits our cognitive, well thought out appraisal mechanisms. For example, and this happens in Boston in the autumn a lot, I bet, that you're driving along and a dry leaf skitters across and you immediately slam your brakes on because you think it's a squirrel or you just see motion. You're not like, oh, brown object moving, maybe it's an animal, forget it. The squirrel's going to be dead by then. If you think it's just this automatic, instantaneous appraisal that then makes you slam on the brakes. And so we do this for so many things. You're hiking in the woods and you hear some noise in the bushes. You're not evaluating what's going on. You have a fear response. Blood rushes to your legs in that instant, right, before your kind of cognitive appraisal has kicked in. And so this is really important And this is one of the functions of emotions, is this automatic appraisal. So it's influenced by both our evolutionary past, and there's certain things that will kick in an emotional reaction for everyone. Two things that will kick in fear: an object coming flying through the air at you, for everyone will have this reaction, a physical reaction of ducking. Your heart starts to pound, blood starts to rush to your legs, and a sudden loss of gravity, like if this chair collapsed right now. I should do it sometime. I should get a trick chair just to demonstrate. So there are certain things that for everyone is going to trigger an emotion. And then there's a lot that are personal, and we're going to be looking at this a lot tomorrow when we look at that emotional timeline, because one of the ways that we can bring awareness, and this for me was such a huge key, because I'd studied the Buddhist contemplative stuff when I studied Cultivating Emotional Balance, was looking at what we call sometimes we call it an emotional alert database. So all of us have this database of potential triggers just waiting to detonate. And a lot of them are personal because of our personal past. And I think we can all kind of relate to that. There's times that we'll react emotionally to something that another friend that's with us in the same situation is like, what's going on with you? What's happening? Or vice versa. Because it's something in our personal past. So one of the things that we do in Cultivating Emotional Balance is really try and bring awareness to some of those emotional triggers. And then there's a big debate, and I fight with Paul Ekman and Eve Ekman, his daughter, who's a second-generation emotions researcher, and they say you can never uproot them completely. And I'm like, in Buddhism, there's nothing that can't be purified. And so we have this ongoing debate of, can you actually get rid of those personal triggers completely so they're not going to be triggering at all? So it's like the fight between the Buddhist nun and the psychologists about whether you can or not. But they agree at least you can definitely uproot a lot of those triggers. Even if you can't get rid of them completely, you can bring awareness and attenuate them so they're not controlling you. You have much more emotional regulation of those triggering things. So tomorrow night, this is an advertisement to come back tomorrow night for the really juicy part, which is looking at these things, right, that are from our personal past. So in which we sense something important to our welfare is occurring. And that's what gives us this automatic appraisal, is something that's very important to our welfare is happening. And so that's where the automatic appraisal kicks in. It includes a set of physiological changes, and we talked about that, the pain in the chest, some sensations in the body. And for some people, that's the first clue that you're becoming emotional. What we do in the full 42-hour is re-trigger emotions and then sit and pay attention to what are the sensations in the body. It's a little bit gendered, I hate to say, but the research shows that for a lot of men, sometimes they're not aware of what emotion they're experiencing, but they know that there's something going on in their body. And so a lot of times for men, by cluing into, oh, my stomach's kind of clenching, it means I'm afraid, or my, something feels hot, or like my heart's pounding, that means I'm angry, whatever it may be, tuning into the physiological changes, because a lot of emotions have this accompanying physiological changes and behaviors that begin to deal with the situation. And so the psychologists say that emotions evolve to sort of coordinate this, full-on systemic response to something important that was happening in our environment. Okay, so it's kind of pulling together the physiological, the psychological, the behavioral, right? These behaviors that are prompted by that emotion for dealing with something important that's happening in that situation. So efficiently coordinating these diverse response systems so that we can respond to challenges. So that's kind of the long-winded definition of an emotion, but you can see all the little different bits and pieces that are involved with an emotion. So when you say, oh, a thought that disturbs my peace of mind, you can see, no, it's a lot more than that. A lot of the dictionary definitions also include what Annette said, this idea of it just kind of takes me over. You know, it's sort of out of my control. It just sort of swoops in and then I'm just kind of subject to it instead of me having some kind of a control over it. Okay, any questions about this definition? Yeah.
Would it be considered a conceptual exaggeration in any case? You know, even...
No. We don't want to get rid of fear, for example. We want to get rid of paranoia and exaggeration. But when the bear is running at us out of the woods, we don't want to be like, oh, it's just a conceptual exaggeration. I'm just mindfully aware of the sensations in my body. Yeah. Run, or climb a tree, or play dead, depending on what kind of bear. You know, there's this thing, I just moved from central British Columbia, where there's more grizzly bears per square inch than anywhere else on the planet. And so, in the town where I lived, they were constantly putting on these workshops called Bear Aware, about what to do, like with the different kind of bear and how close is it to you. And then there was this one workshop that said, well, you really need to differentiate between a defensive attack and a predatory attack. And I'm like, predatory attack? And there's all these things you do to a grizzly bear, and then the last thing on the list is, if the grizzly bear starts to eat you, and I'm like, dude, man, the grizzly bear starts to eat me, I'm already going to be dead of a heart attack. Like, forget about like yelling, screaming. They were like, do whatever you can if the bear starts to eat you. So yeah, we're not, you know, it's not an exaggeration to respond appropriately. There are certain things that are an exaggeration, or we read too much into things, right, for sure. Now, if we're going to put on our Buddhist hat, which I don't have to because I wear the entire outfit all the time, we will say, you know, that the way that we see things as existing from their own side, that's always an exaggeration, but validly perceiving a danger, a conventionally existing danger, is not that kind of exaggeration. So we have to differentiate between kind of the ultimate level and the conventional level. So the conventional level says, yes, there are things that are really dangerous, and it's not an exaggeration to respond appropriately. However, there are a lot of times that, for example, something can seem like something that was triggering from our personal past that, you know, is not going to give rise to the same emotion, and then we're responding to it inappropriately. So we'll talk about that. And that's one of the differences between constructive and destructive emotional episodes. Do you have? Yeah.
Are there other examples of emotions besides fear?
Yeah, we'll talk about it. We're going to look, probably by the end of tonight, we're going to look at what we call the 7 universal emotions, and then the difference between the constructive and destructive examples of all 7 of those. So that really comes into that. Because in this, skipping ahead a little bit, in cultivating emotional balance, we don't talk about positive and negative emotions, because that's more subjective. Does it feel good to feel it or not? We talk about constructive and destructive because even something that doesn't feel that great, like fear, we can have a very constructive emotional episode, even a fear episode that saves our life, right? So we don't talk so much in this training about positive and negative, because then, you know, you think, oh, well, I'm supposed to feel happy all the time, and all of these other emotions have no place in my life, and that's a complete distortion, because they all have their function, and to have a very well-rounded emotional life. So that's a great question, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah. Any other questions about this definition or reflections? Okay, so let's talk about some of the characteristics of emotion versus moods, your personality, values, thoughts. So we differentiate emotion from all of these other things. And so we say that emotions are very short acting, and so they don't last long. So if you feel like you've been afraid for 3 days, it was either that your fear kept getting re-triggered, and it could have been re-triggered by an external stimulus or a thought. A thought can be a trigger of emotion too. We wouldn't say that you were in a state of fear, you know, consistently for 3 days. Now, we say that there can be a trait. People can have sort of a fearful or timid kind of personality trait. There can be moods that are similar to an emotional state. When you have a mood, you often can't tell what the trigger was. You'll just be in a mood for a couple of days, so maybe you'll be in kind of a fearful, slightly paranoid kind of mood for a couple of days, but it's not actually the emotion of fear, which is very short acting. And then very quick onset. Remember this thing of automatic appraisal. It doesn't take long. You don't have to decide what to become emotional about. Kind of unfortunate if we could just choose and if it was all a cognitive process, but we wouldn't be here because our lives would not have been saved all those times that quick automatic appraisal was happening. So very, very quick onset. Distinctive physiological changes, we talked about that, different things going on in your body. For fear, the blood rushes to your legs, preparing you to run. You don't decide, ooh, I need some blood to my legs because the bear's coming. In anger, the blood rushes to your hands, preparing you to fight. So it's interesting, different physiological automatic responses. Catalyzed through both external and internal stimulus, so we can become very emotional by a memory, right? By a thought, by a memory, things like that. Even by our imagination, right? A dream, all these internal stimuli, and then obviously external stimulus. There's a facial signal that's involuntary and universal for what we call the big seven, and we'll look at these in a minute. Universal emotions expressed for 0.5 to 4 seconds, median 2 seconds, and the duration is related to the intensity. So this goes back to Paul Ekman and his research. And did anybody see that television program Lie to Me? Okay. Was it good? Is it? Yeah. And one of the things he said was, like, sometimes there's these rumors, like you can tell that somebody's lying because they look up to the left or something. And he said, no, it's not like that at all. But if what they're saying and their facial expression doesn't correspond, and he is so tuned in to facial expressions. And so sometimes people will show what he calls a micro expression. It'll sort of leak through, even when we're trying to control our expression. There's a little micro expression that'll leak through, and there's all these times that he slowed down a videotape of, like, say, an interview. Like a interview, there was one with a woman who said she was innocent of some crime or something, and then when they were interviewing her, it was at the trial or something, and then he slowed it down and watched it frame by frame and showed where, when the prosecuting attorney was asking a question, she was denying it, but this fear face leaked through, but you couldn't see it consciously, but it was there. So it's super interesting, these micro expressions. Or you'll try and be suppressing it, and there'll just be a very, very small kind of movement. It's kind of freaky being around him. I know him now. Like, I can't say we're friends. He really likes me because his daughter and I teach together, and he knows that she really loves me. We were teaching recently. He's coded every single muscle in the face with a number. And I remember he said something and he goes, oh, that was a little bit of a 4 with a slight 23 and a 7. And I'm like, dude, I don't even want to talk to you. Like, you know everything. It's like, if you ever want to be around somebody who seems completely clairvoyant, Paul Ekman, he did this study and he electrically stimulated on his own face every single facial muscle to map them out and show how they corresponded to every possible emotion. And I tell you, it's freaky to be around him. I mean, he teases me with it because he knows I'm like, no, don't read my mind, you know. But it's all there. So we'll look at some of the more obvious ones. I won't go, oh, that was a 4, and that was I haven't studied them in that extent. But for these 7 universal emotions that he studied, there they are. And there's a characteristic set of triggers that's also universal, and we'll look at these for these big 7. And the reason we're going to focus on the 7 is because there's a universal facial signal for these 7, they were super important for our evolution. And Paul Ekman's research, what he did to do this research was go to Papua New Guinea in like the mid-60s to an uncontacted tribe, because there was thinking at that point, and even Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, thought that signals for emotion were learned, and there was cultural differences in the signals for emotion. And so Paul Ekman just wanted to check it out, and so he went and lived with this uncontacted tribe and found out for these 7 universal emotions, there's also a universal facial signal that this tribe that hadn't had any contact with anybody from the outside also showed exactly the same. So it really revolutionized this idea in anthropology about cultural signals of emotion needing to be learned. And very quick appraisal of what's happening. They're not unique to humans. Our primate cousins also have all 7 of these emotions, some of them very similar facial signals. The great primatologist Franz de Waal has worked a lot with Paul Ekman, and they've had a lot of discussions, and he's written books kind of showing the different emotions, including contempt. And that's one of the universal ones, and we'll talk about what's the evolutionary function of contempt. That one's really interesting. Individual differences in how we express emotions. And they say in children, even as young as I think it's like 8 or 9 months, we start to learn to suppress our emotional signals. So even though there's these universal, signals of emotion, but very individual differences in how we express them, that we learn even before the age of 1 year old, we start to learn to suppress some of our emotions. There's distinctive thoughts, memories, and images that accompany the different emotions. And also distinctive subjective experience, a characteristic set of sensations that we can become more aware of. And remember I said, we can become much more aware of the sensations in our body that accompany the different emotion. The target is unconstrained, not specific, and this means that there's a theme. For example, the theme for anger is removing an obstacle, but it can be a person, a car that cuts in front of you, you not getting the promotion at work. That's what this means by the target being unconstrained. There's a certain theme, but then the object of that obstruction can be a number of different things. There's what we call a refractory period that filters and focuses what information is available to us, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about that emotional episode timeline. We've actually renamed it the selective filtering period because it's a little bit more, clear what it means. When you're in the grip of an emotion, when in that emotional episode, everything that you experience for a certain period of time is filtered through that emotion. So think of an example of somebody says something and you get angry. Maybe they understand that you're angry and they're trying to placate you and make up for it. So they say something really nice and you just go, oh my God, look at that, they're so manipulative, I can't believe it. Which is why you can't always make up with someone in the moment. You have to wait until that refractory period or that selective filtering period is over. It doesn't always work to try and fix things right away. It's like you need a cooling off period, because it's almost like no matter what you say, while the person is still within that period of being emotional, everything they perceive is going to be distorted. Talk about a cognitive distortion. It really distorts the inputs. So sometimes the smartest thing that we can do is just take a break, wait for our own, because it works for us too, right? That we have that refractory period too, and then we need to wait and then come back later on. So the function of emotions, and we talked about this a little bit, they save our lives with that quick appraisal and response. So using fear to swerve away from an animal on the road. So I can't emphasize this enough. In Buddhist practice and cultivating emotional balance, doesn't matter what, we're not trying to wipe out our emotional life. Not only would things be really boring, but we probably wouldn't survive. I don't know, for a person without any emotional repertoire at all, and I know there's a lot of more research being done now on, especially children on somewhere on the autism spectrum who don't either experience or seem to express certain emotions, and it can be very, very difficult for them to navigate the world and not so safe for them in a lot of situations. They can't really read the emotional expressions of others. They don't have the full repertoire of emotions themselves, and so it's problematic, across the board. They motivate us into action, and then they help us in communicating and understanding the wants and needs of others through these distinct signals in the voice and the facial expressions. And so for a lot of evolutionary psychology, we need to think back at our evolution for, up until the last about 10,000 years. We've lived in very, very small bands, in a lot of places in the world, a lot, longer than that, lived in very small bands with other people that we had close relationships with, either kinship or other types of relationship with, that we needed to communicate with. Even before language, we communicated more with our faces and sometimes our they call them vocal bursts. They're not words, but different vocal bursts. Like, what do you say when you're trying to express sympathy to someone? Aw, right? So things like that. What do you say when you're standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon? Wow. So there are all of these things that the researchers call vocal bursts that also signal our emotional state a lot of the time too, in our facial expressions. And so this is how we evolved to communicate with others, our emotional states. All right, so I said before, we don't talk so much about positive and negative emotions in terms of the subjective experience, but we talk about constructive and destructive emotions. And so constructive emotions we very simply define as emotions that are conducive to our own and others' happiness and further cooperation and collaboration. Okay? And then destructive emotions, regrettable emotions incompatible with our own and with others' happiness. So can anybody think of a constructive emotion that may not feel so good subjectively in the moment, but is constructive, that in the long term leads to collaboration and cooperation? Can anybody think of an example? So unpleasant to experience, but constructive.
Your parents and you get angry at your child because they're doing something wrong and you're doing that in order to correct their behavior.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And the real typical example, your kid's running into the street. Oh, Johnny, please don't do that. That's not really good. Get back here, and you manifest that to save their life, right? It's an angry manifestation. You might even feel anger, but it definitely is constructive. Yeah, good. And then there's an example here, and then over here.
Embarrassment, when the realization when you're in a group that you've done something, or people have talked to you about it, and all of a sudden your realization.
Yeah, that's right. You have that regret. And that's an interesting one. There's a difference of opinion between Paul Ekman and his student Dr. Keltner, who says shame and embarrassment is another universal, because he says there is a universal signal. He said you can only see a blush in light-skinned people, but everybody, he said there's a thing, you kind of look down and expose your neck, and primates do that too, and you're showing a kind of contrition, or like, I'm sorry, showing vulnerability, by this kind of looking down, and it invokes other people to forgive you. Interesting, that posture is very kind of primal, and primates do it too, and it invokes forgiveness. So that's a very interesting one, but it's true. It can be very constructive, even though it's not on the list of the big seven. Doesn't feel great, teaches you something, invokes forgiveness on the part of other people towards you. Yeah, Yeah, and you had one.
I think jealousy can be constructive to the point that it might motivate us to action to better ourselves, but I mean, kind of, I guess typically it seems a negative kind of emotion.
Yeah,
The point that might motivate us to better ourselves, so I guess.
Right. One of my teachers, Sangster Khensi Rinpoche, once was talking about emotions, and he goes, jealousy. What a loser emotion. He just goes, it's just, almost nothing feels worse than feeling jealous, and it never really works to get us what we want. In fact, it usually totally backfires that you demonstrate jealousy and the other person's like, ooh, get away from me. No. Like, so that one is an interesting one, and that one does not have a universal facial signal because it wasn't always evolutionarily beneficial to express your jealousy. That's one that we often try and mask, right? So that's an interesting one. We'll have to, the jury's out on that in my own mind of can there be constructive jealousy. It's interesting one. It may not be, I might go with my teacher who says, oh, what a loser emotion. Yeah.
I mean, if you put your Buddhist hat on, from a Buddhist perspective, jealousy is the catalyst to rejoice, like the antidote to jealousy is rejoicing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's positive.
Right.
So if it spurs you to rejoice for the other person.
Because you're trying to practice to overcome it. Yeah, but then from that Buddhist perspective, every negative emotion, if you apply the antidote, then it's really good that so it's a little bit of a catch-22. Yeah. What about sadness? Does sadness feel good? Can there be constructive sadness, do you think? Yeah, grieving a loss. And it's interesting because we were talking about this in prison, and we said, what about sadness? One of the inmates said, oh, no, sadness can be really constructive because it shows me that what I lost really meant something to me. Because sadness, the kind of universal trigger for sadness is loss. And then it shows you, oh, that was really important to me. Also in our evolutionary past, it doesn't always function this way now, but in our evolutionary past, one of the big functions of sadness was eliciting comfort in the face of a loss. So if you showed the facial, and what's the sadness expression? Yeah, the corners go down, even if it's just a micro expression, the corners of your mouth go down, sometimes really exaggerated. There's a thing that happens in your eyebrows that's really, really hard. Eve Ekman can do it. I wish she were here. She can do it like willfully. And it's really hard to do if you're not actually feeling sadness, that the inner corners of your eyebrows kind of peak up like that. Can anybody? I can't do it unless I'm really feeling sad. Yeah, and that's doing it. Great. Go in that. You could do it. Yeah. So there's like a little wrinkle, and then her eyebrows going up, and then the mouth going down. So that's the signal. And evolutionarily, what does that invoke? Aw, sympathy and comfort in the face of a loss. And think about like a memorial service, right? Everybody feels sad, they're telling stories about the person they love. There's this kind of bittersweet kind of, we're all sharing the loss, and there's a comfort to it, which is why we do it, really. It's for us. I mean, we're supposed to honor the person, and you put up a thing of all the pictures. They don't care. They're not there. It's just something we do really for us. It is respectful and all of that, but we really do it for us because it's easier when you're grieving to share that loss with other people kind of experiencing the same thing. So sadness doesn't feel good. The people that use the words positive and negative might say, oh no, negative sadness. I mean, you never see anybody in a Pepsi commercial showing that face, of sadness. But it's something that we evolved for a reason, and it does have that universal facial signal. So what about a destructive one that feels good? Destructive positive, that's sort of an oxymoron, but what about a destructive emotion that feels good? Any example of that? What's that? Revenge, yeah, revenge. Sweet revenge. Yeah.
And pride potentially can be.
Pride could be, yeah, that's right. Like you won the promotion at work by like stomping on everybody else, and in that moment, there's a German word. Anybody know this word? Schadenfreude, which is rejoicing over others' misfortune, right? Being happy. I think, America, we didn't have these magazines so much in Canada. I think Canadians are really famous for being nice, and they don't even have magazines like the National Enquirer and all of these horrible in the supermarkets. And what is it? It's like the misfortune of rich, famous people we're jealous of. That's what it is, isn't it? I mean, that's all it is. It's not good things that happen to anybody. It's like and now, it's Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. I mean, they're working that. They got a divorce because he cheated on somebody else, for the millionth time. And everybody just can't wait to read about that. And it's this taking delight in others' misfortune. I remember one that I saw years ago, and it was so hideous. I'm just trying to buy my tofu and broccoli, and I was somewhere like a Safeway because I was in some small town and there wasn't a health food. And I looked down, and the cover of one of those magazines was like, plastic surgery gone horribly wrong. And I was like, there were these before and after pictures, and it was those years that everybody's getting their lips enhanced. Remember that? Like everybody's getting some injections. Oh my God, it had all gone horribly wrong. And then I was like, why would anybody pay like $3.50 for this magazine to just read this story about like these things? But obviously somebody enjoys it because they pay them, and there they are at the checkout counter at every Safeway. So it's that. That would be one, that destructive emotion that actually feels good in some weird way, that Schadenfreude, like taking delight in others' misfortunes. So you can see now why we prefer to use the language constructive and destructive. So constructive emotional behavior, emotions in the right amount, proportional to the event that called them forth. So we can have sadness, but we can also have a destructive sadness if it just goes on and on and on, and life doesn't seem worth living, and even a year after we lost our spouse, we're just contemplating suicide on a daily basis, right? So that would be out of proportion to the event and not so constructive. So constructive emotional behavior expressed at the right time and expressed in the right way, appropriate to the emotional trigger and the circumstances, and in a way that's not harmful. So when we talk about emotional behavior, these are some of the ways that our emotional behavior can be constructive, even if the emotion that we feel doesn't feel good, but it still can be constructive if it kind of fulfills these criteria. And they can get us into trouble when we feel and show the right emotion but at the wrong intensity, overreacting, or for an inappropriate duration. So it's even an appropriate emotion, but just kind of wrong in terms of intensity. Or we feel the appropriate emotion but express it in a really hurtful way, like being passive aggressive when you're angry, going behind somebody's back. An inappropriate emotion is triggered, we feel the wrong or an inappropriate emotion. That would be like laughing if someone really gets hurt, something like that. Sometimes that's just nerves. It's not always pleasure. Sometimes people just get nervous, kind of in the face of others' misfortune. Or we're just totally unaware of our emotional experience, and we're completely unaware of the way that we express it. So just being clueless about our emotional experience. That's one of the ways that they can be destructive. Nearly all emotions can be expressed in both a constructive and a destructive way, right? No matter what the emotion. So any questions about that? Constructive and destructive. Yes?
I'm just wondering how either, things like chronic pain or people who have experienced, some type of trauma over extended period of time, how that may or may not play into what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, and we'll look at this when we look at the emotional episode timeline, I think sometimes trauma, especially very early in life, can put such an imprint in that emotional alert database that then we overreact. Or you think of something like PTSD, something like that. Like anybody who's experienced some kind of trauma will definitely have a reaction, but hopefully it will abate over time. But when it doesn't, when it just lasts for a long period of time, and then almost anything that's at all related will trigger it, then we would say that's sort of out of proportion and exaggerated and not necessarily constructive, because it can really, a lot of these, I was just reading about this the other day about veterans with PTSD and kind of the increase in PTSD and the ones that have it and the ones that don't, the ones that get it and the ones that don't get it for prolonged periods of time, and what the differences are even in the kind of event, the initial event that kind of gave it to them, in the first place, and some of the criteria there. And so we would say it would definitely be dysfunctional, any kind of trauma like that, that just impeded our constructive functioning, like over the long term. So therapies can help. Learning about this cultivating emotional balance is one thing that we can all use, but when there's something like that that's deep, deep trauma, then we need a lot more, very specific help for kind of uprooting the exaggeration of that, I think. Yeah.
Chronic, obviously people deal with chronic pain ongoing, so it's the same type of thing.
I think it's the same thing. Yeah, and learning just mental resilience. Like learning how to be resilient in the face of even unwanted situations, because there's such a gamut of different reactions of people in chronic, have chronic pain, or even some kind of any kind of long-term illness, or even cancer or something like that, long-term disability in terms of the reaction. So kind of learning coping methods, learning some ways to be resilient in the face of what's going on, because the mind is so powerful. No matter what's going on in the body, so much can be overcome, with the mind and with the attitude and with the proper attitude. I saw a video once of this young man who was one of the thalidomide babies. He basically just had a torso and didn't have any arms and legs. And they showed him swimming. He'd learned how to do all of these things. He was happily married to this woman. He was like one of the most happy, positive guys. And you just think, oh, well, no way. If you were born without arms and legs, like, forget it. How could you even have any kind of a life? He was like a motivational speaker. He didn't even use prosthetics. He just kind of went around in his torso, because that's all. It was just, I was like, whoa, that guy, boy, maybe some lifetime I'll be like that, because I couldn't even imagine. And that's an extreme case, but I think a lot can be kind of overcome with the mind. Yeah. Any other questions or comments about the constructive and destructive emotions?
It's just a comment, but I'm struck when, you were talking about sadness and grieving, and many times people use humor.
Yeah.
Like you hear, like sometimes when you go to memorials, not Buddhist memorials, but Christian memorials, people will get up and they'll do the reflection on this. And the ones that people seem to take a lot of joy out of, even though they're grieving, are these funny stories. They relate these funny stories about this person.
And we actually say, the psychologists say, grieving isn't an emotion. It's sort of a state that encompasses a lot of emotions. The sadness is in there, but the humor is definitely in there. A lot of love is in there, compassion for other people sharing the loss. So the grieving itself is not said to be an emotion, because it's quite a complex kind of constellation of a lot of different emotions and sort of states of mind. And you're right, the humor, that's what often happens, isn't it? You tell these stories and everybody laughs and there's this kind of poignancy to it, but it really is kind of part of that whole process. And sometimes the stories make you cry. You laugh and then you cry because you realize, oh, we're not going to ever share those moments. So it's very complex, but very healthy. Very, very healthy. I was reading a study recently that for a long time psychologists said, oh, if it's a huge loss, of either someone dies or even a marriage breaks up that's a very long-term relationship that you lose somehow. Easily 2 years, they expect you to grieve that loss on some level. And then I heard lately, and I don't know if it's because of the insurance industry or what, that they're shortening the amount of time, and now 2 months after a big loss, they're telling people, get over it, pull yourself together. You know, this time frame that's kind of considered to be an appropriate time for grieving is like shortened because of the insurance industry. Like, we can't pay you to go to grief counseling forever. Now, straighten up, you know, which is just like ridiculous because human psychology hasn't changed at all. But it is, and it goes in cycles too, you know, grieving, the whole kind of process. It's really a big process, isn't it, that grieving? Yeah, yeah. All right. I'm feeling like the next thing we're going to launch into is the 7 universal emotions, but I'm feeling like that would be a good time to break for tonight. I think you've gotten a lot of information, and just to reassure you, it's not going to be as data heavy as it was tonight for the subsequent nights. We're really, you know, I'm trying to give you some of the framework and the definitions, and then we're going to be working with it. So tomorrow night, I keep thinking next week, but it's actually just tomorrow, we're going to look at those 7 universals that Paul Ekman has identified. We'll look at the function of all of those 7 universal emotions. We'll look a little bit at the signal in terms of the facial expression. And then we'll start getting into our work with the emotional episode timeline. So if you notice an emotional episode between the next 24 hours, remember it. And remember the features of it. And maybe it's one that we're going to break up into small groups and work together to map out some of our real life emotional episodes. And then we'll, you know, that's a way to bring a lot more awareness to our emotional life. So that's kind of on the plan for tomorrow night. Any last questions or comments? Thank you for your attention. It was a lot of fun. I love teaching Cultivating Emotional Balance because I find it all so interesting. So if you do, just try and plan to make it to all 4 nights because it really is progressive. All right. I hope all the traffic jams have cleared up, and I'll see you tomorrow night. Are there any announcements or anything? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good, wonderfully clear teaching. Thank you so much, Venerable.
You're welcome.
And of course, everyone, can you hear me? Because I'm not using a microphone. Yes. Everyone, obviously, if you can make tomorrow night, please try at 7 o'clock. Tomorrow we'll be here again. And this weekend, of course, we're having Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is also a workshop style teaching, and we'll have a potluck on Saturday. So it's all kind of, you know, you can get to know each other and, of course, spend some really valuable, wonderful time with Venerable Choki. And so tomorrow we will have an opportunity to offer kachas and a group offering as well. So thank you very much. And again, we are a volunteer-run organization, and we don't charge for any of our teaching, most of our teaching. So if you've enjoyed what you heard tonight and found it helpful, we would very much appreciate any kind of material, you know, donation, but as well, you know, just your support. We always are looking for volunteers. So we really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.